You're listening to a podcast by Way Collective, a contemplative community for love and liberation in Santa Barbara, California. This recording was the conversation starter at our Dinner and Dialogue gathering on March 26, 2025. Thanks for tuning in. So, over the past couple of weeks, we've been discussing how to overcome the myth of separation through embracing a non-dual mind. In the first week, we discussed how to recover the perspective of seeing the world from a place of interconnectedness. And last week, we looked at how transformative life experiences of great love and great suffering and keeping an intentional practice that we call the prayer of the heart can both help us tune into this perspective. And so tonight, I want to discuss a bit about one of the strongest dualisms that we see in our spiritual lives, which is the dualism between the sacred and the secular. And I remember when I was probably about 12 years old, it's probably around 1995 or so, I got my first Sony Discman for Christmas that year. And I was so stoked, and I remember getting 2 CDs to go with it. It was an album from a local Christian band called The Cry, with a K, at the front, and Michael W. Smith's Greatest Hits 1983 through 93. And I was living the dream. I had God-honoring tunes I could take with me anywhere. I felt so cool. But as my CD collection grew, there was a common theme that began to emerge. It was bands like DC Talk and Audio Adrenaline, the OC Supertones, and Amy Grant. And what I realized was I didn't own or even listen to, for that matter, any quote-unquote secular music. My parents had made the choice that what they were going to allow in their house was Christian music only. And, I do remember my mom spinning Please Please Me by the Beatles on an old 33 when I was growing up. And I also remember that she had also gotten these cassette tapes of nothing but golden oldies that she had picked up from the Shell gas station. So I listened to those. But at some point, my family had decided to only listen to Christian music. Anybody else grow up in a house like that? Or is it just me? Okay. Now, this is just one example. But what needs to be noted here at the outset tonight is that in our tradition, the division between the sacred and the secular goes all the way back to the Jewish purity codes in the Torah. And almost as far back as humanity has conceived of morality or of the good, things have been divided up into clean and unclean, pure and impure, and good and bad. And the truth is, there's something inherently moral about understanding wrong and right. Through certain stages of development especially, having a strong sense of what is good serves us both individually and communally to know what to do and when, and how not to hurt others or ourselves. But the trouble is, when that perspective gets merged with life in community, we human beings have a tendency to create in-group and out-group loyalties. And we all know that what happens when we do that is that it's always the good people who are in our circle and always the bad people who are over there in that circle. And this is just true of our base evolutionary biology as human beings. But when this sensibility gets merged with religion, things begin to get chopped up into the sacred and the profane, or the sacred and the secular. And this can happen in any faith tradition, but we've especially seen it in Western Christianity, as evangelicals have adopted what I like to call the not of this world tradition. Have any of you seen those bumper stickers before, the NOTW bumper stickers? Let me give you the short version of this theology that accompanies the NOTW mindset. Basically, the world we live in is inherently fallen or bad, and the story goes that God will ultimately redeem it by destroying it and creating a new world that is only good through and through. So within this kind of religion, individuals are called to separate themselves from the secular culture, sometimes called the world, and to live into whatever their Christian in-group deems sacred. We see this in both radical, kind of cloistered or cultish groups, and popular, which I would say like fundamentalist evangelical forms, right? But what we have to recognize is that at the heart of this perspective is a core division or dualism. There are sacred things and there are secular things. Like the music I just brought up at the beginning tonight. Sacred music would be worship music or Michael W. Smith or whatever CCLI artists you listen to. And secular music would be any of the bands on the regular radio. And as I mentioned, I wasn't really allowed to listen to secular music for whatever reason. But it wasn't until high school when I had my own car that I could just turn on the radio and hear whatever hits were charting at the time. And to be sure, I know that my parents' intentions were good and that their goal was to raise kids who prioritized their faith and God over everything else. But what ended up happening, and I think this can happen with any sacred story or narrative that we're given if we're not careful, what ended up happening is that when we chop the world up into sacred and secular, is that those of us who have learned that bifurcation or that dualism have a much harder time bringing things that are seeming opposites back together. For instance, we talked a couple of weeks ago about the political divides in our country and how the default norm right now is to pick a side and throw stones at the other side, because they are always the enemies who are at the very least incorrect or at the most oppressive. And there's actually this fascinating story about Jesus and stone throwing in the Gospel of John that I know many of you are familiar with. Essentially, there's a woman who's caught sinning, and there are a group of religious leaders, read men here, who are ready to give her the good biblical punishment for such a sin. But Jesus, being a good non-dual teacher, steps in. He draws a line in the sand and says, "You who are without sin, cast the first stone." And one by one, beginning with the oldest, they each set their stones down and walk away. So, notice with me for a moment what Jesus is doing. He is, in essence, driving a spoke in the wheel of the accusatory religious games of his day, and he's offering them another way, the way of compassion. I love author Rachel Held Evans' take on this because she noticed that those same accusatory phenomena are still happening within Christianity in our time. She noticed that people love to quote the part of the story where Jesus tells the woman to go and sin no more, and not so much the part of the story where it says, "You who are without sin, cast the first stone." So on this, she writes, "We have our own purity codes these days, people we cast out from our communities or surround with Bible-wielding mobs, labels we create and assign to those who don't fit in, conditions we place on welcome, sins real or imagined we delight in taking seriously because we'd like to think they are much more severe than our own." And she says, let's not forget that Jesus told that woman to go and sin no more, Christians like to say when they're afraid this grace thing might get out of hand. "Lord, have mercy," she says. "Of all the people in that story, we've gone and decided we're the most like Jesus." I think it's safe to say we've missed the point. We've missed the point when we turn this story into a stone. Okay, so some of you may recall that we also talked a couple of weeks ago about how it's much more difficult to be the person whose stones are being chucked at. Like, what do we do when we are the ones who are being targeted by the othering impulses we see in our world? The reality is, we do need to learn to keep firm boundaries and limits around violation or violence that allow us to keep our true selves intact and less vulnerable to the forces that oppress. So we have to have an honest conversation with ourselves about what it looks like in practicality to protect ourselves. To not put ourselves in situations of harm. But we also have to admit that we can't control what other people do. We can only control our responses to the stone throwing of others. So when Jesus is getting crucified and says, "God forgive them, they know not what they do," he's responding to a violent situation with a posture of forgiveness. And in saying that, he's not condoning their actions. He's not furthering supremacy culture. He's not taking a passive middle ground stance in the midst of a violent regime. I think he's accessing that place of inner forgiveness that we all have, where he can let go of that which he cannot control. So again, I don't mean to belittle the experience of abuse or oppression. It's serious stuff. My only hope is to offer up an option of choosing that inner stance of mercy merged with healthy boundaries so that we are not overwhelmed when others are attacking us in any respect. So, what's the lesson here? Putting our stones down altogether is what we're talking about when we talk about non-duality and the sacred and the secular. We tend to think that sacred equals holy and secular equals unholy, right? But stories like this mess up our dualisms. They show us that all of us are imperfect, and it is in that imperfection that we all actually belong. Non-duality invites us to get off our high horses and onto a level playing field with one another. Non-duality says, I see me and my mess in you and your mess, and it's really okay because we are in the same boat. I sometimes call a better option the secular, which is a bringing together of the sacred and the secular. And one of my favorite theologians actually has a book on this called Spiritual Bankruptcy, where he talks about the need for Christianity to secularize itself. And what he means by this is not that Christianity needs to go the direction of the secular humanist who might remove the sacred from nature altogether and live their lives as if the sacred doesn't exist. What he actually means is that Christianity needs to turn its eyes outside of the chapel or outside of the sanctuary or the temple and turn its concern back to the real, actual world with its real, actual needs. So John Cobb writes, secularizing a given tradition means subordinating its sacred concern for another world, like heaven, say, to concern for this one, both in theory and practice. He says it means to overcome the rigid distinction of us and them, which is particularly dangerous in a pluralistic world. And it's important to secularize the sacred. So he goes on to make the point that not only Christianity, but all great ways, all great religious paths can be secularized. And that what they do when they do this is they seek to draw knowledge and understanding from the best thinkers of their day and realize the unique potential of their movements and work more confidently and vigorously for the common good. So, again, another way to say this is that we are not called to give up the transcendent for what is immanent completely, but to rather apply our understanding of the sacred precisely to what is immanent to create a better world. Remember, Richard Rohr said that to know unity or to know union with the divine, we must somehow ourselves become the unity. Or I would say, we must become a human location for unity to exist. We must light that inner flame. So when Jesus taught on the kingdom of God, he said the kingdom of God isn't coming with things that can be observed, nor will they say, look, here it is, or there it is over there. For in fact, the kingdom of God is within you, or among you. I think that he means by that there's this place within each of us that we can access, where we can live from a grounded center of compassion and mercy and forgiveness toward everyone. And I think that much of the spiritual journey is about trying to find peace, and mainly this inner place of calm, centered ground, where we can live and move in the world from this place of forgiveness. And what Jesus teaches in practical ways, is essentially to build that muscle memory of being a person of unity. Because when we become people who see inherent interconnectedness everywhere, and we look for commonalities rather than differences, we access that place of peace that he calls the kingdom of God. So I hope that tonight we can see how unnecessary playing the game of the sacred versus the secular is. I hope that what emerges for each of us is another way of being in the world, which is the way of holding all things together. And the way we hold all things together is to forgive reality for being what it is. To forgive the mess inside me and inside you, just like that story about throwing stones. So building that mercy muscle memory is what this is about. And what we begin to see from the eyes of God within us is that there is nothing missing anywhere. There is belovedness all the way down. The secular world is dripping with sacredness in the most ordinary and astounding of places. And when we can give up our punitiveness, when we can give up our judgmentalism, and we can let go into love and welcome and acceptance, we end up transforming both ourselves and, in turn, the world around us. Okay, let's talk about this. Thanks for listening to this podcast by Way Collective. To keep up with our community, you can subscribe to this podcast, go to www.waycollective.org, or follow us on Instagram at @waycollective. Peace and every good, y'all.